Welcome to the Love Conquers Fear podcast. I'm so proud to be kicking this off with all of you. This is a real passion for me. I really think that the next 10 to 15 years determine whether or not humanity makes it. On this podcast, I'm going to have some of the most famous technologists, entrepreneurs, investors, and spiritual teachers. So we're going to cover a wide range of subjects. God is giving us the final exam to say, hey, you have to figure out collectively how you'll get love to conquer fear, or it is over, because we're going to have technology that's so much more powerful than anything else we've had before. As an entrepreneur, as a dad, as a husband, all of us need to lay it all on the field right now to make sure that we manifest that future that we want. I'll be very clear-eyed on that in this podcast, as well as in my book, which is also called Love Conquers Fear, with the subtitle Humanity, AI, and the Age of Abundance for All. I'm going to be exploring this on the podcast is, what are we going to do when we plug into brain-to-computer interfaces to the point where we can connect with AI? Does that mean that AI is going to have a communion with our soul? My hope here is that this podcast and my book that I'm writing are part of the light that we all need to make it to this age together and have that unity and that prophecy come true, that heaven and earth actually do merge. Team humanity all the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Love Conquers Fear podcast. I'm so proud to be kicking this off with all of you. This is a real passion for me. I really think that the next 10 to 15 years determine whether or not humanity makes it to what I'm calling the Age of Abundance for All. On this podcast, I'm going to have some of the most famous technologists, entrepreneurs, investors, and spiritual teachers. And so we're going to cover a wide range of subjects for humanity coming together, what I call team humanity, to really make sure that we make it to that age and that we don't destroy ourselves. Right off the bat, I want you to know that I'm 95% certain that we are going to make it, but there is a 5% chance. And the way I look at this as both a human being, as well as an entrepreneur, as a dad, as a husband, is that all of us need to lay it all on the field right now to make sure that we manifest that future that we want. And I'll get into what I mean by the age of abundance for all, but I really mean for all. I'm talking about even for countries like Chad in Africa, which have a GDP of $660 per person, compared to the US having over $80,000 per person. And we need to think about all of humanity under the eyes of God. We're all created equal and we're all divine at our core and in our essence and our soul. I'm going to get into a lot in this podcast, from mystical experiences that I've had to my entrepreneurial background, and ultimately what my plans are personally. But the most important part of this podcast is you hearing from other people that I'm going to have on here. I've been very blessed to have a huge network. I've been an entrepreneur since I was 24. I've been programming since I was age 7. And I've been fortunate enough to be a successful entrepreneur. So why don't we start out with that? Let me just tell you a little bit about me. For those of you that don't know me. So I'm 53 years old right now. And I started programming at age 7, as I mentioned. I was very, very blessed to have a mom who realized that she had a kind of a different son. This was 1979 when I started programming, and she got me my first computer and learned how to program with me. And I'll always have this incredible love in my heart for my mom. Because she actually, growing up here in Austin, Texas, she actually kept everybody out of my way. And that's really hard to do, because there's so many forces when you're growing up that are telling you as a parent to get your child to study Mandarin now, or get your child to, do this with robotics or whatever it is, or play the guitar. And my mom would really defend me to everything from teachers as well as extended family telling her that she was ruining me, that I didn't know how to play football, I didn't know how to do anything else but work on that computer. Well, I don't harbor any ill will towards any of those people. I have no hatred in my heart. I really don't. But I am so lucky to have been raised that way, because it meant that I was so prepared for what was about to happen. And I know that I was born with the purpose to change the world for the better with technology. I programmed over 40 hours a week growing up. And I started my first company when I was age 24. I was lucky enough, after going to UT Austin and meeting my soulmate, Deborah, who I've been married to for now 29 years, I was lucky enough to get into the Wharton School. And at that time, Wharton was rated the #1 school in the nation for business for 6 years in a row. And that was incredible to get in. It was my top pick. And Wharton for me was really transformational. And at age 24, in my first year there, I started my first business. And that first business was doing what I knew how to do through Deloitte Consulting, where I'd worked at, which was building a lot of early web applications. And it was pretty incredible. I was making $250 to $350 an hour at age 24 because I had this skill that not a lot of people had, building these web applications, and primarily sold to Wharton graduates who had their own businesses who needed someone with that skill. That business I continued to run the whole time I was at Wharton, earning my MBA in high-tech entrepreneurship. And I ultimately started several others when I was there in parallel. I don't recommend this, by the way. I had 3 businesses going at one time, at one point at Wharton. But I started a company called BodyMatrix, which sold sports nutrition products, things like power bars, vitamins, and the rest. I built the e-commerce platform from scratch because, quite frankly, I was bored. One summer, I had sold a project that I'd finished in half the time. I had nothing else to do. And that company, BodyMatrix, I was selling all over the world. It was incredible. I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs working in retail. And I was like, Mom, Dad, I'm selling all over the world. It's unbelievable. People are ordering from U.S. Air Force bases and overseas. And there was an article about me and my wife Deborah in the Jewish newspaper in Philadelphia, saying, selling to the world. I mean, this is how early it was in the e-commerce days. I also started a company called MBAZoNe, which really had a lot of the functionality that you see on Facebook today. It allowed current MBA students, as well as prospective MBA students and MBA alumni, to connect, ultimately discuss all types of topics, make friends with each other. But it was advertising supported, and I hated selling advertising. So ultimately, I got out of that business. My co-founder ended up running that business for decades, and that was ultimately what her passion was. So those were my first 3 companies that I bootstrapped, and then I decided to go for a really swing for the fences move. So I realized in my own e-commerce site, BodyMatrix, that I had this ability to understand what people were doing online, which was incredible. When I grew up working at my parents' store, I would see what the customers were doing. But online, I could have the biggest brain of all because I could see everything they were doing, everything they were clicking on, what ads were bringing them in. And so I started a company called Coremetrics. And Coremetrics became a big company. It became my first global company. We ultimately exited that company for around $300 million to IBM. And Coremetrics really popularized the software as a service model. But boy, did I go through trauma in that company. Coremetrics went from 0 to 100 clients in less than a year. And then the dot-com bust happened, and we went down to 3 customers. I had to let go of 2/3 of the team. It was super traumatic. And ultimately, we pulled out of that and turned it around and won Walmart. And I'll never forget the day that Walmart announced via a press release that they're working with Coremetrics. And that then became a tipping point where all the retailers wanted to work with us. So Coremetrics, was my first really big venture. I ran that from age 26 to right around in my early 30s. And ultimately, I had this amazing thing happen at Coremetrics. I was working with this guy named Brent Barden, who reported to me. He was our head of client services. And he came to me and he said, "Hey, Brett, I also am an entrepreneur. I came here because my company had failed and I just needed to get back on my feet financially. Would you like to brainstorm with me? Because I know I'm going to leave and start another company, and maybe you can be the chairman of my board." Well, that was quite a shock, I have to say, because he was by far and away one of our best leaders at the whole company. But then I immediately caught myself and I'm like, I am a super big hypocrite this is my inside voice, if I say no, because I'm an entrepreneur. Like, this guy's an entrepreneur. Of course I'll help him. So we started to brainstorm. We came up with the idea for Bazaarvoice. Bazaarvoice is spelled Bazaar, and it means voice of the marketplace. And I left Coremetrics to start it with him as the CEO. And he played lots of roles at the company. We ultimately built an incredible company there. We're at the right place, right time, because what e-commerce needed the most outside of web analytics, which we had at Coremetrics, is it needed social commerce. And gosh, our timing was so good. Bill Gross of Idea Lab gave this great TED Talk where he said the single most important factor for whether or not a business is going to be successful is your timing. And we're right about to see that social media wave where, Facebook was closed to the public. It was about to open up. Twitter didn't even exist. There was no such thing as Snapchat or TikTok or so many other things. I mean, the iPhone didn't even exist. This was 2005 when we started Bazaarvoice. So ultimately, we went all in, started that company, and we went from 0 to 100 million of annualized revenue in 6 years and had a $1 billion IPO. I always say to people, entrepreneurship is grit and luck. And definitely we had the grit, but I always remind people that there's lots of people in America working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. We also had luck. We had a thesis for the timing and it worked out. And it was a huge blessing and really the source of the primary prosperity that I have today, to be able to do things like bring this podcast to you and write my next book, which this podcast is the predecessor to that. So that led to me actually retiring for a while. I went to study Vedanta in India, which is an amazing philosophy about how to live a very happy life. It actually predates a lot of the world's major religions. I invested in startups. We've been doing that now for, 15 or so years. We're in 147 startups today. 12 of those have become unicorns. We're also in over 45 VC funds. And a lot of those have become superstar successes, including, here in town in Austin, Multicoin, which is one of the original crypto funds. So, a lot of grit, a lot of luck. And then all of that led to starting data.world, which really became a foundational layer for data in the enterprise, really tying together all of those different data silos in a knowledge graph, which mimics the way a brain works. And that became the ultimate tool to plug into AI. I had incredible co-founders there with Matt Lessig, with John Loyens, with Brian Jacob. We built an incredible team. And like Bazaarvoice, we were rated one of the best places to work in Austin. Bazaarvoice actually was rated the #1 place to work in Austin when it's small, then medium, then large. And I'll be talking about, company culture and how to really manifest that whenever I meet with capitalists on this. I'm sure we'll get into that. But, data.world also continued that tradition of having a great culture and ultimately got acquired by ServiceNow. And check this out. I really had become much more spiritual, and I'm going to get a lot into that in a second. But ServiceNow announced that they acquired the company on 5/7. For those of you that already know me, Lucky 7 is because of my mom. It's the name of my blog, lucky7.io, if you ever want to check it out. And the deal actually closed on 7/7. And I had nothing to do with the dates, right? I was, ServiceNow contacted us. I would have been happy for them to buy the company earlier. They're a phenomenal company. They have $10 billion in cash. They're the third fastest company to ever grow to 10 billion of AR, led by an amazing CEO. And the team, ultimately has joined ServiceNow, and my presumption is they're doing great. I was unique in not joining them because I know my core calling is ultimately to be an entrepreneur, and I really wanted to ultimately produce this podcast, write my next book, and really just lay it all on the field personally with my friends and the people you'd be seeing on this podcast to manifest that age of abundance for all. So let's talk about mystical experiences. I'm going to get into this, and I want to talk about things that are seen as taboo. So first of all, I have prayed since I was pretty young. Okay, I've always believed in God, and I will tell you that the power of prayer has been a big force for me since I was young. Now, it's important to say that I've never asked God for anything but strength. Okay, I'd never asked God to become wealthy or anything like that. But I've gone through a lot as an entrepreneur. I mean, there's been some really rough times, and that power of prayer meant a lot to me. And ultimately, when I was age 50, I wanted to know, does God really exist? And by the way, you could look at anytime I say God, just in your mind, if you believe something differently, say the word consciousness, or say the word the astral plane, or say the word the universe, right? People talk about manifesting beauty in the universe and how the universe sometimes gives them a nudge. So I'm going to use the word God because that's my knowing, but you can use whatever word you want. But when I was age 50, I did my first pretty significant psychedelic experience. And psychedelics are pretty taboo because of what happened in the Nixon administration. If you haven't watched the documentary on Netflix called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, you really should watch that documentary because you should get educated before you just write it off. I have a lot of people that tell me when I bring up the topic of psychedelics, they're like, oh, I don't do drugs. I'm like, do you drink alcohol? They're like, of course I drink alcohol, right? Well, I don't drink alcohol. And, alcohol is nothing but a poison. Now, it's played a big role. There's been lots of big things that have happened with alcohol. I mean, our founding fathers of this country toasted over the Declaration of Independence with Madeira, which is a great spirit. And many of them lost their lives. And so it's a phenomenal social lubricant sometimes, but I don't need that. I don't need that social lubricant. And, I'll challenge you to find a study that says that psychedelics are bad for you. Now, when I talk about psychedelics on this podcast, I want to be clear. I'm talking about them in a very sacred fashion. It's not something I do very often. I do it with great intentionality, and I do it to ultimately connect to that spiritual plane. And boy, does it do that. I have this deep knowing of God. Now, one thing I want you to know is that if you meet someone and they say they understand the nature of God, nobody understands the nature of God. Okay, nobody. Dalai Lama, anybody. God is so far beyond our comprehension. I ultimately believe that consciousness is fundamental and is the very fabric of our universe. And I'll get into that with one of my very good friends, Mark Gober, who will be the next guest on this podcast. But consciousness being fundamental, you could say that that's God. I don't know. One thing that I do know from doing psychedelics, that whatever that force is, it's loving. And that force cares about us not exterminating ourselves. And it cares about us manifesting love in this universe. And it wants us to leverage this earth school that our souls find ourselves in to manifest love to the greatest degree and ultimately end up propagating eventually the universe, figuring out how to break faster and light speed travel and so many things that are assumed laws of physics that we don't know today. And we're going to find out with the acceleration of AI, quantum computing, robotics, and eventually brain-to-computer interfaces. I mean, all that is within our grasp here in the next 10 years. And I can't even tell you how exciting that is, how daunting that is. It also means with great power comes great responsibility. So I've done, a number of psychedelic journeys. Each of them have been really profound. I've had some where I've had that very deep experience with God. I've seen things like the earth being born. I've gotten direct messages from God in terms of what we need to do as humanity to ultimately make it. And I've got friends that have had similar experiences, and it really is profound. It's definitely not for everyone. I will also tell you that it's helped me a lot with my meditations. I regularly now have transcendental experiences in my meditations. I just got back from the Grand Canyon, where I was completely off the grid, no mobile phone working, no electricity, nothing. And I had many meditations there without any psychedelics that were completely transformational. And so there's lots of ways to kind of tap into source. Source is in Judaism, and the Torah is actually a proper noun. It's also called the divine source. And ultimately, that tapping in really will take you to very profound places. But like, there's some people that are naturally spiritually tuned to the point where they can tap in incredibly well. There's an example of a yogi in India, a pretty famous story, where he tapped in so profoundly that someone gave him 600 micrograms of LSD. That is the most powerful dose you can possibly take. Okay, your body can't take any more than that. I've never taken anything of that kind of strength. My journeys last, 3.5 to 4 hours, and it didn't even affect him at all. That's how tapped in he was, that it had no effect, right? He was already able to constantly navigate source and have that type of experience, which is really pretty incredible. Ultimately, my journeys took me to this real exploration where it started to animate my soul more. And it started to make me think a lot about what is the nature of us being human? Like, what does it actually mean to be a human? What is consciousness? How do we have this self-awareness? And so my soul was getting more and more embodied in my physical body and started to take me on a journey of reading. And I'm going to synthesize lots of books for you today. I'll be diving into different books when I have my guest on. So I'm going to give you a fast pass on a lot of these books. But ultimately, I want you to have just a quick distillation of what I've learned over the past 7 or 8 months. Okay, so I'll take you into that in a moment. Okay, so continuing on with psychedelics for a moment, this is just really kind of blows my mind. So our former governor here in Texas, Rick Perry, has decided to dedicate the rest of his life to helping vets who we lose more vets by suicide in the United States than we lose by combat. Okay, there's over 20 vets a day that kill themselves. And so he's dedicated the rest of his life to a psychedelic called Ibogaine. Ibogaine is something I've never done. That's like an 18 to 24-hour journey. It's for people that are opioid addicts, people that have literally killed in combat or seen a lot of killing in combat. So these are people that have serious PTSD. They're really, really in a broken state. And it's like a brain reset from all that I've read about it. I was at TED this year. I've been going to TED, probably for 18 years. The head of Stanford's Brain Research Center ultimately gave this talk about the wonder drug of Ibogaine. Ibogaine is just a plant, right? It's just a plant. I think it grows in West Africa. But the efficacy of this cure, opiate addicts from their addiction, one dose will cure an alcoholic. So it's not something you're going to hear a lot about with pharmaceutical companies, maybe, because this is a cure. And if I had killed in combat, I was never even in combat or, from the military background, I would want access to this. And a lot of people go to Mexico to get access. Well, historically, here in Texas, just a few months ago, $50 million of funding passed in the Texas House, championed by, Governor Perry, former Governor Perry, with Governor Abbott signing off on this. So look, I don't like everything that Texas does. I want to be clear of that. There's a lot of things that I see socially in terms of punching down, which I don't condone. I'm an independent. I believe in rationality. But there's a lot of good things that happen. You've got to be able to look at both sides and some of the good things that happen based on any administration. And in this case, this was a huge win. This is more funding for psychedelic research than has happened in any country or state since the Nixon administration announced the war on drugs and made psychedelics a taboo thing. So that's pretty amazing. And you'll hear me in this podcast get into the consciousness awakening that is underway. And I think that awakening is God waking more and more people up. It's consciousness saying, hey, wake up, because we have this future of abundance for all waiting for us if we just wake up and go for it, as opposed to this scarcity, fear-based, winner take all, zero sum mindset, which takes us in this place of, if China gets AGI, artificial general intelligence, before us, it's all over for us. And if we get artificial general intelligence before them, it's all over for them. It's ridiculous. In a world of 8.2 billion people, this is a very ridiculous notion. So anyways, I am now hosting a dinner for former Governor Rick Perry, as well as Brian Hubbard and Marcus Luttrell and some other people that are associated with this initiative to help raise money for Ibogaine, scaling nationwide for vets with a prescription, highly monitored, so that they can heal. And this is kind of a miracle that this drug exists, that this plant exists, that God gave us this plant that literally resets the brain. In some of these brain studies, these vets are de-aging their brain by somewhere between 3 to 5 years. It actually makes the white matter around their brain regrow. I mean, it's really kind of incredible. And so anyways, as I talk about things like psychedelics, I just want you to have a bit of an open mind. You're probably thinking, hey, I'm not the type of person you hear talking about this. And I would encourage you, again, if you have curiosity, watch that documentary on Netflix, How to Change Your Mind. Read the book by Michael Pollan of that same name, and just get educated. Just get educated before you just write it off. Especially if you're someone who drinks alcohol socially and are one of those people, like so many people I meet, he tells me, no, I don't do any drugs. And I always ask them again about alcohol, and they almost always say that they drink. I don't, because there's no efficacy in alcohol, as we talked about. Okay, so let's get into some of the books that I've read and how my soul became animated to ultimately go on this journey. And I'm talking about the journey of an intense level of learning that I've done in the past 7-8 months. So I was in India at the end of last year in a place called Kerala. We had just gone to a beautiful Indian wedding in Mumbai, over 1,000 people there. And Kerala is where Ayurvedic treatments begin. And ultimately, it was in Kerala where I watched this documentary that a very good friend of mine recommended called Inner Worlds, Outer Worlds. You can get this documentary on YouTube for free. I know it's available on streaming services as well. It's phenomenal. And the thing that was incredible about this documentary is it really brought science and spirituality back together. One of the things I'm going to be talking about on this podcast is materialism. Materialism is this belief that, another way to describe it is the hard problem of consciousness, is that 13.8 billion years ago, there was this inexplicable Big Bang. Again, give me the miracle of the Big Bang as a materialist, and I'll explain everything else to you. And through lots of random collisions, chemistry eventually happened. Eventually, simple life happened on Earth, starting in the seas. And then eventually it got to complex life, and then inexplicably consciousness just popped out. And that is a very hard thing to accept and believe. We have no idea where consciousness comes from. We do know if you have a damaged brain, you're going to experience consciousness differently. We also know that our eyes only see about 15% of reality. There's lots of animals that can see all types of things, from magnetic energy to ultraviolet. We can't see those with our eyes. So, consciousness is something that I've come to believe, again, is fundamental. And that documentary, Inner Worlds, Outer Worlds, is a good place to start your journey. And that was a very good place to start to awaken my soul to this possibility of the fact that we live in a world where the universe is full of vibratory energy. And, everything, when you go down to its essence in matter, is light. It's energy. And as far as we know, there is no end to energy, including in our body. And I believe that our souls are energy. One thing that we know about the universe is it's 4% matter. That means 96%, we have no idea what it is. Some people call that dark energy and dark matter, but we really don't know. We don't know what that's made of. We don't know how it connects everything. I believe that it's a connective tissue for the universe. We don't know if there are other dimensions. We don't know if heaven is in another dimension or not. There's just a lot of things that we need to get very, very curious about. But that was a big opener for me. And I had gotten a recommendation when I was interviewing John Mackey, who is one of my best friends and actually wrote the foreword to my book. I want to show you this really quickly. This is my first book that I wrote. It's called The Entrepreneur's Essentials. And John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, wrote the foreword. He's an incredible spiritual teacher to me and business teacher. And John and I were on stage at an event here in Austin. And one of the people made a beeline for us. And the beeline they made for us is that we should both read this book called Proof of Heaven by this guy, Eben Alexander. And it really felt like one of those moments where I should listen to him. It was a doctor. His name's Bob Frockman. He's a very good friend of mine. And Dr. Frockman was telling me and John to read this book. Now, I'm not sure exactly why Bob recommended that book, but I will tell you that John Mackey's book, which is called The Whole Story, which is really a tell-all about the creation of Whole Foods, chapter 1 of that book starts out with his psychedelic journey, which led him to overcome his fear to start Whole Foods in the first place, which is interesting. So I don't know what Bob was thinking. Maybe he thought we'd be open-minded, because in that chapter, John Mackey talks about the ineffable essence of that experience, how it was inexplicable, and where he knew that humanity was one, and the unity that's prophesied in so much ancient spirituality. But I started to read that book, when I was in Kerala, and oh my gosh, it is such a beautiful book, and it's really a great book for skeptics, because Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon who's Harvard trained. And Eben Alexander is someone who started to really lose his faith. He grew up as a Christian, and he really, he'd see his patients say, "Wow, I just saw the light," or "I just saw this." And he's like, "Oh, they're just hallucinating, they're just making this up in their mind," until it happened to him. So he goes into this coma because inexplicably he gets E. coli powered meningitis. Okay, this is a very bad form of meningitis. E. coli eats you from the inside. He goes into this coma. Everybody's like, best case, he's going to be a vegetable, and in terms of his brain, it's going to be eaten almost away. But he's in this coma. He's been given a tour of heaven by this angelic being. And I don't want to tell you too much about the book, but heaven is very different than what he would have ever assumed from the scriptures that he was exposed to going to church when he was younger. And it gets him to come back. And they tell him in the journey of him experiencing heaven that he's going to come back and survive this. And he makes his whole life purpose to spread this message of, hey, our reality, our physical reality here, the world of form is amazing in terms of being our earth school. And our goal here is to manifest as much love and connection with each other. In Judaism, as I mentioned, I'm Jewish, the core mantra is tikkun olam, to repair the world. So he comes back with this zeal for life and ends up writing 3 books. The second book he wrote is called The Map of Heaven. And this is a combination of combining Eastern and Western spirituality. I loved that book so much that I read it twice. These are great books on Audible because you can hear the awe and wonder in his voice. And it was a really good springboard to my initial initiation in realizing that the reality beyond is incredible. And again, I knew that it was incredible because I had been through the psychedelic journey. So I'd seen some of the things he was talking about, but he brought it all together in such a beautiful way in this near-death experience that he had. And I've since gotten very educated on near-death experiences. I personally never had a near-death experience, but here's something that's pretty shocking to me. I've had a lot of friends for a long time. 5 of my friends, since reading that book, have told me they've had a near-death experience where they've seen the beyond. Okay, that's incredible. And I was like, well, why didn't you bring it up to me before? And they're like, you wouldn't have been open to it. I'm kind of embarrassed to talk about it. Like, it's kind of like talking about psychedelics. Like, people assume that you're too woo-woo or whatever, but this is ultimately the nature of our reality. So it's pretty incredible that it is, and it actually makes life that much more beautiful. Not because that this heaven is waiting for you, but that that we're lucky enough to be a soul in this physical reality with this embodiment of a divine purpose, versus just floating on a random rock in a vast universe where nothing matters, right? That's kind of what a materialist thinks. They're just like, meaning is only meaning that we make up in our heads, that there's no purpose to anything. And that's a very cold place to be if you really think about it, because it means that if you're in that material form, you might as well get as much as you can, right? Get as rich as you can, eat whatever you want, drink whatever you want, because you got one life to live. And once you die, that's it. It's lights out. And so it's really powerful to know that there's a beyond. And so those books, Proof of Heaven by Eben Alexander, as well as The Map of Heaven, really were the next level of the initiation of my soul. And just incredible, incredible books. Okay, so continuing on with my journey here, I came back to Austin after India, and actually one of the integration coaches at the Psychedelic Center I go to said, I think you'd be really interested in Mark Gober's work. And Mark has written 7 books. One of the books that he wrote is called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And this book really posits that our brains receive consciousness. And the thing that makes Mark a really special guy is that he's a Princeton grad who became captain of the tennis team. He was very much a materialist. He thought nothing matters outside of material form. He went and got a top job on Wall Street. He went to be, one of the top consultants in Silicon Valley. And when he was 31 years old, he's like, I'm really suffering. Like, I'm kind of depressed. Like, is this really it? I've kind of done everything that I'm expected to do. And I just feel miserable. And so he started to explore health podcasts. And one of them he listened to, he came across this concept of our brains receiving consciousness. And he thought, no, that can't be right. Just broke his material paradigm. And so he ended up just going total Wall Street analyst research mode on figuring out what that meant and whether or not that was just BS. And he ended up concluding, no, this is real, and wrote a whole book on it. And then he did a podcast as well called Where Is My Mind? And this is a highly produced podcast. You should definitely listen to Where Is My Mind? Well, those two, that book and that podcast had a big impact on me. And so I reached out to Mark and I said, hey, I love your message. Like, it's amazing that it's you giving this message as someone who really was a mega skeptic. Would you like to come to Austin, get to know me better? I'll probably be able to set up a YPO event for you. Maybe we'll do a dinner at the home that I'll help curate. And he said yes. He very much leads by intuition. His heart said to go for it. He came to Austin, and it was an amazing YPO event that we did together, an amazing dinner that we had together. That dinner actually evolved into the discussion on whether or not artificial intelligence could ever become conscious. It was really kind of incredible. One of the things that happened at that dinner that I just want to be transparent, really hurt my heart and was a seed planted, is at that dinner, one of the attendees said, humanity, yeah, what job has humanity done? And it was a really just kind of like, there's no hope type of message. And it really hurt my heart because, to want to help save humanity and be a part of the light overcoming the dark, you actually have to start with loving humanity. And if you don't love yourself, then it's hard to love anybody else or hard to love humanity. And look, I'm Jewish. Like, there was the Holocaust. I mean, there's been all types of atrocity happen in the world. But that doesn't mean that the majority of the world is bad. We're kind of in this perverted state because of social media and the regular media. And I'm a big fan of the free press, but realize that we're being algorithmically manipulated. We're being programmed every day by this really negative dystopia. In a world of 8.2 billion people, every day you could tune into a murder or something horrible happening. Or you could instead choose to read things like the Progress Network, and you could read things like Fix the News, which are all about all the positive scientific breakthroughs that are constantly happening in the world. The potential cures for diseases, the potential breakthroughs that are going to solve climate change, those are happening every day too. And so if you don't deprogram yourself and start to tune in to some of that news, it'll be buried because the algorithms aren't going to surface that. Enragement equals engagement. It's going to keep you clicking. And remember, those are ad-supported businesses, whether it's a New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, or whether it's social media. You'd be shocked maybe to know that Facebook or Meta brought in $45 billion of profit last quarter. Okay. Mark Zuckerberg announced recently that he is going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on data centers for AI. Now, that could be amazing, right? Because Llama is an open source model and there could be a lot of light come out of that. But we now know for a fact that social media leads to a lot of suffering. There's been documentaries like The Social Dilemma about the amount of suffering. Tristan Harris, who was really prominently featured on that documentary, talked about the fact that it's both a utopia and a dystopia. I agree with that. I am one of those rare people who does not allow social media to take over my life. I have a presence. I spend probably 90% of my social media time on LinkedIn. Maybe that makes me boring to you. I don't really care. That's where I find highest utility, and that's where I find the least algorithmic manipulation versus a platform like Facebook or X. But I still have a presence on there and occasionally pop in. But I catch myself. I don't allow it to rule over me, and I don't allow it to program me to think so negatively about each other, and all of the things in the world. There's big challenges. We've got a lot to solve. I'll be very clear-eyed on that in this podcast, as well as in my book, my next book that's going to be coming out, which is also called Love Conquers Fear, with the subtitle Humanity, AI, and the Age of Abundance for All. And the book is really all about our ability to transcend this time and really use those accelerating technologies to create that world of abundance. But again, only if we change ourselves from the inside and get out of this scarcity, fear-based, zero-sum mindset that we're currently locked into. Okay, so the next book that my soul really was yearning to read was Mark Gober's second book, which is An End to Upside Down Living. And this really is a book about how to embody this knowing of our brains receiving consciousness and consciousness being this loving force. And it goes into all types of things. That book goes into psychedelics, it goes into meditation, It goes into many different subjects about how to live in a very present way, in a very happy way, in a very fulfilled way, where your soul is more embodied in your physical reality. Fantastic book. I actually read that book as well twice. It's that good of a book. So that ultimately took me into this next book. And this one's going to sound pretty wild to you, especially given what I've told you about my background. And it was a book that I actually found through listening to a podcast called Buddha at the Gas Pump. I promise you that the well of content for consciousness or spirituality knows no end. If you dive into this, you'll be shocked at how much content is out there. Well, Buddha at the Gas Pump, never heard of it. It's been going since 2009, over 780 episodes. I found out about it through Mark Gober's books and podcast. Again, his podcast called Where Is My Mind? So I find this guest on Buddha at the Gas Pump named Chris Bosch. And Chris Bosch was kind of like the guys that open up the Drake Passage, or one of those real pioneers who he decided that he was willing to die to find out the nature of our universe. And he did something called the Groff method, where he took 600 micrograms of LSD during 73 journeys for 20 years. At the time, he was a professor, and he couldn't tell his students that he was doing this, or anybody else. He would have gotten fired. And he wrote a book about it 20 years later. He had to wait until he retired from academia to write this book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. This book really blew my mind. He finds out that through all these journeys, which are really high dose, I would not recommend doing a journey like this. This is like 8-hour journey. There's sometimes seizures involved, lots of throwing up. I don't do anything like that. But he was willing to die for this answer. And he finds out in his 73rd journey that God, what he calls my beloved, was taking him that whole time through the exploration of all different reality types in the universe. And he ultimately finds that we're in an evolutionary journey right now. Humans are built for evolutionary speed. We are the fastest evolving animal on the planet by far. And we're by far and away the most intelligent animal on the planet with the most in tuneness with consciousness, with self-awareness. So what Chris Bosch writes about in chapters 9 to 11 of that book is the birth of the future human, what he calls the diamond soul with diamond vision. And I'm not going to spoil the book for you, but you got to read it. I mean, it's really, really profound. And it prophesies something that all of the ancient religions prophesy, which is eventually that heaven and earth will merge. Now, you can look at that as metaphorical. You could also look at it as mystical. But ultimately, what I believe about that is that we're in an evolutionary process right now where we're on the cusp of manifesting this age of abundance for all. And that's going to feel very heaven-like, because that means that we have successfully allowed love to conquer fear. That means that we have successfully manifested a future where we solve disease, where we have nearly unlimited energy, where we have nearly unlimited food, where we have nearly unlimited water, including in the poorest countries in the world. And we're going to do that because technology costs just plummet to a point where access exponentially increases. And I think it's within the next 10 years that humanity has access to artificial superintelligence at nearly no cost. I actually think in this case, open source is going to win. Open source did win the foundation of the internet with Linux. And I think the same thing's going to happen with AI. Just to take you on a quick aside on that, on February 21st, President Trump announced the Stargate project alongside Masayoshi-son, Larry Ellison, and Sam Altman. And he announced it at $500 billion of funding. Okay, now, a lot of people miss this, and this is because of the warped perspective we have of the pandemic. And I assume all good intentions, during the pandemic, that we were trying to protect each other. You know, there were body bags lined up in China, in Wuhan. There were body bags lined up in Italy. So we're all terrified. I mean, I don't want to go through that again. And we spent trillions of dollars, right? We ran up the national debt by extreme measures, and so did other countries. And ultimately, had happened is we got that kind of that warped perspective on money. Well, let's talk about what $500 billion is, okay? Stargate, which you can't even kind of make up these names. I mean, it's like the name of many science fiction novels and movies, et cetera. But President Trump announcing Stargate, that is more money, inflation adjusted, than we spent on the space race versus Russia, and more money, inflation adjusted, than we spent on the creation of the atomic bomb versus the Nazis to win World War II. It'd be a very different world if we had lost either one of those races. And I know you may be saying, hey, Brett, you're talking about love conquers fear. There was a fear driver for us to win those races. And you'd be right to criticize me on that. But ultimately, that's just the truth. Like that, those were really, really serious races that we had to win at those times. And one of the ways that I look at this period of AI, quantum computing, and robotics accelerating is it's like God's final exam for humanity. You know, God is giving us the final exam to say, hey, you have to figure out collectively how you'll get love to conquer fear, or it is over. Because we're going to have technology that's so much more powerful than anything else we've had before. But another thing happened on the day before President Trump announced that on February 21st. February 20th, that's when China announced DeepSeek R1, which is a model that's vastly more powerful than the GPT-4 model that got people so freaked out after the launch of ChatGPT that in March of 2023, 4 months after the launch of ChatGPT, there was the moratorium call, shut it down, right? Do not develop any more powerful models for at least 6 months until we find out what the heck is going on. Elon Musk signed that. Many of the world's top AI scientists signed that. And here, China announces an open source model called DeepSeek R1, but most people didn't even pay that much attention, right? That some people started to use it, but it wasn't known how powerful it was until the week after. That's when the NASDAQ lost $1 trillion of market cap. NVIDIA that next week went down by $600 billion in market cap. Why? Because it actually showed that once you distill these large language models to have the weights, all of the distillation of all this content that they're trained on into this vector type of database, and have the weights, that the weights can actually be stolen or can be borrowed, depending on your perspective, and allow an open source model to propagate. You know, our youngest daughter has 5 open source models running on her home computer here. And she's shown me things in those open source models that's pretty shocking what she's able to ask them, like things that probably would not be allowed by ChatGPT to be asked on the internet. So, you know, open source is going to win here. And that just puts in perspective that AI moment for us all, and what we're going to have to grapple with in 10 years. So back to Chris Bosch's book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. Phenomenal read to really understand someone going through this journey, these journeys, to find the ultimate nature of our reality. It's a mind-blowing read. It's one that I've turned back to multiple times. I've read chapters 9 through 11 3 times at this point about the birth of the future human. You know, ultimately, I wouldn't do that personally in terms of taking that high dose of a psychedelic, but I'm glad that he did and lived to tell the tale, and that he wrote that book for all of us to learn from. Again, just like any pioneer who risked their life to do something for humanity did, and then wrote the book to tell the story. So we owe him a debt of gratitude to write a book like that and to be brave enough to put it all out there. there's a lot that we can learn from that book for the time that we're now living in. So the next series of books that I started to go through were all around quantum physics. Okay, I decided that I'd done a lot around spirituality. Of course, I've read a lot of books on AI, everything from Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Nearer to Genesis, which was Henry Kissinger's dying work. And, these books were really profound at shaping, how I think about AI and the responsibility for humanity in this moment for all of us. Again, Team Humanity. But I really wanted to take this diversion to go into quantum physics. And quantum physics is pretty weird. It's really exciting. If you're into science, it gets really weird really fast. And so I dug into Robert Lanza's work. I'd written this blog post on Medium. You can follow me at data.world on Medium. And I've been writing a lot there. And I wrote this book, I wrote this post, felt like a book, on consciousness and how that, we'd had this AI winter and now we're having an AI spring. And we had a consciousness winter in the past and now we're having a consciousness spring. And one of my friends, who's fellow Wharton grad, said, hey, I think you'd really like Robert Lanza's work on biocentrism, which is a quantum physics theory that delves into whatever it calls the many worlds phenomenon, that things are constantly quantum branching and there's many copies of you out there in the quantum realm. It gets very Marvel kind of very fast. But I read The Grand Biocentric Design. And it's a really fascinating book. It really was just kind of mind-blowing to read. And it actually made me sync with a lot of the other books I had read now on spirituality, as well as now this science book I was reading that didn't delve into spirituality at all, in terms of really grappling with the nature of reality and seeing the patterns in between. And if you don't know how quantum physics work, it basically works on a wave function. And one of the big technologies that we have to grapple with over the next decade are quantum computers. And quantum computers rely on what are called qubits. Qubits are in a wave function where they can be a 1 or a 0 or a 1 and a 0 all at the same time. It's called a superposition state. Classical computers, which are the computers that are stable today, including our most powerful supercomputers that work with these large language models, these computers rely on bits, which can be a 1 or a 0, period. There's no wave function in a bit. So a quantum computer exponentially outperforms a classical computer once they're stable enough to do so. And the stability is the really big thing that's being worked out right now with quantum computers. But just to talk about how powerful these things are, last December, Google announced a chip called the Willow chip. The Willow chip did a benchmark computing calculation in 5 minutes that would take a classical computer, take the most powerful supercomputer on Earth, 780 times the known, 780 trillion times the known age of the universe. Okay, it's like 10 to the 25th. So think about that for a second. And when I was at TED last year, Harmit Nevin, who is the head of Google's quantum computing division, on the TED stage is showing this stable calculation. And he says the best we can figure at Google on why this works is it must be computing in a different dimension. Just think about that for a second. That would have been crazy to say that 10, 20 years ago, but he's saying this on the TED stage. And I actually think he's right. I think that it is leveraging the computing power of the cosmos, of the universe, however you want to say it, to do these types of calculations, because they're kind of inexplicable that it works at that kind of speed. And there's a big event coming up with quantum computing that Microsoft and IBM, Amazon, and other companies agree on these dates, that by 2029, maybe 2030, we'll hit this day called Q Day, or quantum supremacy, which means that quantum computers will be stable and powerful enough that all cryptography in the world, including the NSA's cryptography, will be broken. So what's going to happen? There'll be a Y2K type of rush. For those of you that are, similar age to me, you remember Y2K. There was like this mad dash, leading up to the year 2000 to retrofit all these software programs and computers that had programs written in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, where the programmers, you can't make this stuff up, literally forgot to make the date range, the year value, 4 digits. Okay, it's kind of comical if you think about it. And when the computer, when the calendar shifted to the year 2000, it was worried that planes were going to fall out of the sky, that all types of this calamity was going to happen. And so consulting firms like the one I was at the time made an absolute mint during that period, fitting these systems. Well, the same thing's going to happen with quantum computing once it gets that stable. There's going to be a mad dash to retrofit all the major cryptography of the world to make it quantum. Okay, so we'll figure that out. I'm confident we'll figure that out once we have quantum computing that stable. But getting back to Robert Lanza, this book, The Grand Biocentric Design, is really, really fascinating. And in that book, he actually talks about death, in that you don't actually die, which is what all the spirituality teaches, that there is this energy that you'll always have, that your soul will always have. But he approaches it purely from a science perspective. So it's a really, really fascinating read. And that then took me to this diversion to be like, well, what else has Robert Lanza written? I want to kind of see like how he would toy around with that idea, not just in a science book. And I found this novel called Observer that he wrote with this famous science fiction author, Nancy Kress, who's written over 40 science fiction books. And they kind of take his biocentrism principles and explore it in a novel. And it's fascinating. I would just say, read it. It's really fun. It's a great one on Audible as well, because the story's told in a very fun way. Okay, so the next book my soul had me start to read is called The Order of Time. And this is by Carlo Rovelli. It's a pure science book. It's an amazing one on Audible because it's read by Benedict Cumberbatch. But boy, time is a really weird thing. Time, it's posited in that book, is actually an illusion. It's a human construct made for us to make sense of events. And, it very much depends on what planet you're on, what time it is in the universe. A lot of people criticize biblical teachings of any faith because they say, well, how is time so short for God? Like, how is, the universe created, in 7 days, et cetera. But the reality is, from a God time perspective, 7 days may feel like eons to us, because somewhere in the universe, time moves that fast. So, really need to be humble when it comes to time. And I really encourage you to listen to this book, The Order of Time. It's fascinating. I think Benedict Cumberbatch decided to read this book because of how much it impacted him. Fascinating read, totally science-based. It gets very interesting towards the end of that book as it starts to touch on spirituality, but he didn't intend for it to be a spiritual book. But it really syncs with a lot of books I've read on spirituality. And I'll tell you, in psychedelic journeys, I've seen the illusion of time. Like, I've seen things happen in my journeys that were windows into what was going to happen in the future. And then they happened. And that is mind-blowing to me, because when you're connected to source, time functions very differently than it does in this physical reality that we find ourselves in where we're measuring these events. So read The Order of Time. I think you'll really enjoy it if you want to approach this purely from a science perspective. The next book I read is called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Okay, so I was flying to Necker Island for the first time. It's going to sound a little bit fancy. I don't mean it that way. But I was really lucky to be invited by a good friend, Alexander McCoben, to go to Necker Island. This is Richard Branson's private island, to have a leadership conference, with a small group of people. And I flew with John Mackey there. And John and I struck up this conversation about spirituality, and he said, I really think you should read Joe Dispenza's book. So I started to read it. I started to read that on Necker. And Joe Dispenza talks about the ability for us to manifest the future we want in the quantum realm by ultimately learning how to meditate and leverage what he calls the great intelligence of the quantum field. Look, this is just his term for God, okay, or the universe or consciousness or whatever you want to call it. And I know people that have been to these workshops that Joe Dispenza hosts that have really, it's really kind of blown their mind in terms of what type of future they've been able to manifest for themselves. I'm going to go to a Joe Dispenza workshop. I have not yet, so I can't report back to you on that. But I will tell you that that book is great. And it was one recommended to me by John because he's like, look, I really think Joe Dispenza is a very enlightened individual. And I know that, you know, he had an experience with his wife at one of these workshops, which was really transformational for them. And I've heard a lot of those experiences from friends that I trust. So that's another way to approach this work, is to really start to embody, you know, these practices through meditation. And for me, again, psychedelics only helped me learn how to be a better meditator. Okay, so this is pretty crazy. While I'm on Necker Island, okay, we're having dinner with Richard Branson. The subject comes up of this book called The Alchemist. Hey, I've never read this book. I guess I'm one of those people that it was never assigned to in school, but a lot of people have read this book. And Richard Branson jumps in and is like, yeah, Brett, you really should read that book. Well, I go back to my hotel room, and this is sometimes where the universe or God or consciousness, whatever you want to call it, hits you over the head. All the products in the room are branded Alchemist. And I'm like, okay, I know I need to read this book. So I read The Alchemist on the way back from Necker Island. By the way, on Necker Island, I gave this speech on the accelerating forces of AI, quantum computing, robotics, the nature of what makes us most human, how we really need to understand that with this race underway to manifest this age of abundance for all. But I'm on the way back on the plane, and I start reading The Alchemist. And it's a phenomenal book about chasing your personal legend, as he calls it. It's a novel. It's actually read by Jeremy Irons. So similar to Benedict Cumberbatch, he has that amazing British accent. You always feel, you know, smarter when you're hearing someone talking a British accent. And it's just such a beautifully read book, and such a beautiful. You could literally pick up The Alchemist any decade, and every decade of your life you would get different lessons out of it. That's how much wisdom is in that one novel. But in The Alchemist, I keep on going back over this line over and over again, where it says it's always darkest before the dawn. And I knew that that line was a really important one for me. And I didn't know exactly why, but I figured it out shortly after. You know, we had a really, really difficult thing happen at data.world. And I was like, it's always darkest before the dawn, maintain faith. And then, you know, we manifested into this outcome with ServiceNow acquiring our company, which is a phenomenal outcome for all of our employees and, you know, for everybody, including them. They're going all in on enterprise AI. The other thing is that I actually think for humanity, it's always darkest before the dawn. I've invoked that book many times since. You know, people say, Brett, how can you be so optimistic? How can you be certain? Well, I'm not certain, to be clear, but how can you say that with 95% probability, we're going to make it to that age of abundance for all? Well, look, we made it through smallpox, okay? We made it through nuclear weapons. We could already extinct ourselves many times over with nuclear weapons. You know, my friend Byron Reese likes to talk about that genetic records show us that there was one point in humanity's background where there were 800 human beings left on Earth. Okay, the weather conditions, everything were so bad that it almost extinct us. If our core nature as humanity was to be evil to each other, you think we would have made it? I don't think so. And we're descendants of those 800 people, the 800 people that survived. So that's part of what gives me, you know, faith in humanity. But then people say to me, well, Brett, there's all this bad stuff happening right now. look, I am confident that every age in human history, people could say there's lots of bad stuff happening right now. I'm not saying there's not bad stuff happening. Okay, there is. There's a lot of things that I don't like that are happening right now. But ultimately, it's up to us, right? It's up to Team Humanity on what we want to do with the future. Like, do we want to have super powerful tools with the accelerating forces of AI, quantum computing, robotics, brain-to-computer interfaces, and use that to destroy each other? To continue to leverage that scarcity, fear-based mindset that's not going to serve us in an age of abundance. We're not going to make it to the age of abundance if we continue to act and think that way. So what I've posed to you is it's always darkest before the dawn. Like what's happening right now geopolitically, et cetera, it's always darkest before the dawn. It's up to Team Humanity to make it. That book had a profound impact on me. And if you haven't read it, I promise it'll have a profound impact on you. Great one on Audible, again, read by Jeremy Irons. Okay, so the next book that I got exposed to was actually on a podcast that I'm a big fan of. It's the Sam Harris podcast. Sam Harris is an atheist, but ultimately he's a very enlightened individual. I mean, he's a deep meditator. He has an app called Waking Up. Just because he's an atheist, that's fine. I mean, that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that the universe can be a very loving place. But his wife, Annika Harris, wrote a book called Lights On. And it's an audio-only book. Okay, it doesn't exist in print. I don't believe it. It didn't at the time that I got it. And it's her journey through trying to understand the nature of consciousness. And she goes through all the theories of consciousness. And at the end of that audiobook, she concludes that consciousness is fundamental. And it's a really fun kind of exploration of where she's grappling with this, because look, there are dozens and dozens of theories of what consciousness is. Nobody really knows, but it's very interesting that Annika Harris, Sam Harris's wife, concludes that consciousness is fundamental. And it's a fun journey. If you want to really delve into consciousness as a science, it's a fun journey to end up in a place where consciousness is fundamental. And again, if you believe consciousness is fundamental, that takes you into all types of places, right? It takes you into things like the telepathy tapes, that podcast that I really enjoyed and so many people enjoyed. At one point, it was more popular than Joe Rogan's podcast. That podcast, the telepathy tapes, takes you on this journey of these special abilities that these autistic children who don't have the ability to speak, but they have this amazing ability to read some of their caretakers' minds, sometimes a teacher, sometimes their mom or dad. And it takes you through all the scientific study of that. And the most beautiful part about that podcast is the non-speakers in the last episode tell you what message does humanity need to hear. And it's a lot of the same messages from all the books by that point I had read, from The Map of Heaven by Eben Alexander to LSD in the Mind of the Universe by Chris Bosch, So it takes you on this really interesting place where these beautiful children are telling you the message that we all need to hear to wake up and make it to that age of abundance for all. So it was a foundational read for me into the exploration of consciousness. The next book I read, I actually discovered at TED. So at the TED conference, which happens in Vancouver every year, although next year is the last time they're going to have it in Vancouver before they move it back to California, where it originally started. I was introduced to this book by Jamie Wheal called Recapture the Rapture. Jamie Wheal is a very famous author. I found this book, of all places, at a discussion on psychedelics at TED. The TED community is a pretty enlightened community. There's lots of discussions on things like psychedelics, as I mentioned, in the TED community. One of the presenters was the head of Stanford's Brain Center, discussing Ibogaine and how it cures vets and all the studies they had done. I don't think that TED Talk's gone live yet, but you should monitor for it on TED.com. It's a fascinating, fascinating talk. And so I saw this book laying on the table at this psychedelic center. And it was the only book that wasn't about psychedelics. And so I asked the head of the center about the book, and he said it's fantastic. And it is a really interesting book, because ultimately it's an exploration of what we need to do to reclaim our sovereignty, to be the beautiful human beings that we can be, to make it to that future of abundance. Another book along the stop that had an impact on me. I can't say it was as profound of an impact as some of the other books I've mentioned, but it's a very interesting book. So I'd recommend that one. And it was one that my soul wanted me to read. I really have learned to listen to my soul in this body, and I can tell, like I can feel the energy when I see something or hear something that I'm meant to do that. And I'll talk about that one in a second with the book that I'm reading actually right now. Okay, so the next book I read actually was one that Mark Gober recommended. Mark has become one of my best friends. And as I mentioned, he's going to be on the second episode of this podcast. So I was asking Mark, like, what are the classics? What am I missing? And he's like, you need to read Many Lives, Many Masters by Dr. Weiss. This is a really interesting book. And this was the first time that I started to get very interested in the process of reincarnation. So if our souls are eternal, then there's an Eastern philosophy, in Hinduism and other, spiritual traditions, that we reincarnate over many lifetimes. And Dr. Weiss, as you could guess from his name, he's a Jewish doctor. He has a patient come to him as a psychiatrist who's really suffering. So she's a really beautiful woman, but she's just constantly depressed. And he starts putting her into hypnosis to try to find out what's wrong with her. And he has her go back to, where did this trauma start? And it happened in a different lifetime. And he's like, this is kind of inexplicable. He doesn't even know what to make of it, right? As a psychiatrist. And he continues to regress her, and he finds out that the trauma happened over multiple lifetimes. And the most amazing part of that book, I mean, if that's not amazing enough, is that he gets to have conversations through her. It's called channeling. I've seen it, for example, with psychedelics, where she's channeling who the people are, the beings are in the in-between state that are helping her decide where to reincarnate. And she's talking in a very different voice. And when he plays it for her after she comes out of hypnosis, she doesn't want to listen to it because it's like really weird to her. But he wrote a book about it. It's a very short book. I think it's an hour and a half listen on Audible. It kind of cracks open the door to the reincarnation process. I'm currently reading a book that goes much deeper than this one that I'll talk about pretty soon. But that book is pretty fascinating. I'm glad that Mark Gober recommended it to me, and it's pretty out there. But I very much believe that that experience happened to him, and that she was actually channeling from these beings on the in-between. So the next book was recommended to me by a friend, and I really thank her for this book. It's a book called The Celestine Prophecy, Celestine. Had never heard of it before. And it's a book that it's a fable, but it has these profound lessons at the end that it recaps, which is a book about this guy in this jungle, basically trying to find this ancient wisdom, who learns how to pray and learns this ability to see signs. Okay, things that are happening where the universe or God or consciousness is giving him nudges. And these nudges are really profound for him. And since reading that book, I can tell you that I see a lot of these signs now. I mean, sometimes I see signs, 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes they really hit me over the head in a beautiful way, like they did recently in the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, again, totally offline, one of the women I met there told me that her dad, who is deceased, gives her signs through pennies. And she gave all these inexplicable stories about that. And she asked me what signs I received from my deceased parents. And I said, well, it's usually deer. Sometimes it's birds. Sometimes it's butterflies. Sometimes it's goats, and I gave her an example of a hike that I had just been on in the Italian Alps where there's an ibex, this beautiful mountain goat sitting on the top of this boulder where I knew that was my father. I knew what the message was. It was sitting in between the valley and before you got to the glacier. And I had this profound meditative experience with this ibex. It's funny, I fed this into ChatGPT and it created meditation for me as a result of it. But I was telling her that, and at that moment, the sun was going down. There was a beautiful Grand Canyon sunset, and a goat appeared right at the top. And everybody in our party, or 27 of us, looked up at that goat. And the person sitting with us is this guy who's kind of grappling with our conversation and not really sure. And he saw it. And I said, hey, that's an example. And then he said, okay, look, I know this sounds weird, but I just found this coin when I was setting up my camp. And it's really weathered, might be a Navajo coin or something. And he pulls it out of his pocket. And they go and they wash it off, and it's a penny. Okay, this happens all in a minute. So sometimes it just hits you over the head. And things that if you weren't spiritual at all, you'd just be like, oh, that's just a weird coincidence or whatever. But it's a really beautiful way to live where you know that the universe is talking to you and you're able to listen to it. And the Celestine prophecy has allowed me to do that. It was the original gateway into being able to see that. And the beauty of that is just really amazing. A profound, profound read. Really beautiful and audible as well, because it's just such an exciting journey told. So after reading the Celestine prophecy, I get invited to speak at MIT to a group of 50 CEOs. And the person that invited me is the CEO of a company here in Austin called Ticket City. His name's Randy Cohen. He was actually at the IPO roadshow celebration for Bazaarvoice when I took that company public. He had never been to an IPO opening before, and he wanted to go. And I was like, great. He was a customer of ours, and we had such a blast doing that together. So he said, Brad, I'd really like you to speak at our annual event. There's 50 of us. We get together. We've been doing this for 25 years. He's like, what would you like to speak on? I'm like, well, I like to speak on the hard problem of consciousness and the accelerating forces of AI, quantum computing, and robotics, and what makes us most human. He's like, great. I go up, I give this speech. It's very well received. People are talking to me for hours afterwards about the speech. What should they do next? What book should they read? That's part of the reason why I'm doing this episode right now and giving you all these book recommendations and giving you the order. Actually, I read them in. They asked for the order. But one of them says, hey, have you really considered the implication of brain-to-computer interfaces that much in your research? It's a really good point, because the answer was, I really hadn't. I'd seen Neuralink here in Austin, one of the Elon Musk companies, get a quadriplegic to have the ability to do things again, like play video games, watch TV, etc., by just using his mind. And Elon Musk has famously said that it's going to cure blindness, which I believe, because these are just input mechanisms, and our brain actually makes the images in our mind for the input that we're seeing. And so I thought, that's a really good point. I need to learn more about that. And he recommends this book called More Than the Sun and the Stars. And he ultimately encourages me to read it. I get it on Audible. I listened to most of it on the way back. It's by this guy, Adam Dorr. And it's really a fun read about the implications of that technology and a positive picture of the future that could happen with that technology as we achieve this age of abundance for all. Encourage you to read it if you want a novel, a science fiction novel. It's about a girl who is in her 20s, and she was born, with a really bad brain deficiency. And she becomes the first super intelligent being, powered by a brain-to-computer interface connected with AI. And it's a fascinating book. It's the connection she has is with a company called Neocortex. So it gives her like a second brain, essentially a way to plug in the cloud. And it's one that, I think about a lot, because I do think one of the things I go back and forth on with spirituality and consciousness, and I don't know how to think about this yet, okay? I'm just going to put this out there because I'm going to be exploring this on the podcast, is what are we going to do when we plug into brain to computer interfaces to the point where we can connect with AI? Does that mean that AI is going to have a communion with our soul? Is that something the heavens are going to allow? I don't know. I don't even know how to think about that. The materialist would say, look, there's nothing special about us at all. Yeah, we've got, these human bodies and these human brains, but everything is just material. And so we'll be able to replicate everything. So that by definition means that we'll be able to create conscious AI and conscious robots, and eventually they'll be vastly superior to us in every way. I don't think so. I think that there is something divine about us. I know that I have a soul, and that soul is embodied, and that soul has experienced many lifetimes. Now, with brain-to-computer interfaces, are we going to be able to interface with that? I don't know. One of the things that I was thinking about recently is how cool it would be through a brain-to-computer interface to be able to record everything happening inside someone's brain. Like, think about someone in a psychedelic experience, or think about the Dalai Lama, or think about someone that's like a master meditator and being able to see everything that they experience in three-dimensional texture like a movie. And then think about putting all that data together to create a picture of what happens in these mystical experiences, to try to grapple with the nature of consciousness. So, I'll be exploring that topic with some of the experts in this area in the podcast. But right now, I'm not really sure how to think about that. So I'm just putting that out there, being very transparent with you about that. But that's a good book that'll make you think about it too. Okay, so the next set of books, this now takes you into May of this year, is one of them is called The Seed of the Soul. Okay, I've now read this book twice. It's by Gary Zukov. Oprah Winfrey wrote the preface to the 25th anniversary edition of this book. It's been around for a long time. It's extremely divine. I decided to go back into, more spiritual reads, and it really gets you to understand, grasp at the nature of your soul and how to have more of a communion with your soul. And it talks about in physical reality, the material world, that most human beings are five sensory human beings. And that a lot of the suffering that happens in the world is because of that. Again, get everything you want in this lifetime. You only live once, etc. But a multisensory human being is able to have that communion with their soul. And since reading that book, I've been able to have a lot more communion with my soul outside of anything like psychedelics, just in everyday life, sometimes going on a hike, like I'll have a deep conversation with my soul. And that took me directly into this book, which was actually recommended to me by one of those CEOs at that MIT event I did, called 11 Days in May. Kind of ironic because I'm reading this book in May at this point, by this guy, JD Messenger. I was just on the phone with JD Messenger today. Going to be doing a lot with him. And I've now read that book twice. And this is a really profound book, 11 Days in May, because he has this communion with this being for 11 days. And he's able to ask it any question he wants. What questions would you want to ask if you could tap into heaven? He's able to ask everything. Why does God allow suffering? Why are there atheists? So many questions about how the universe works, how energy works. And it's really a profound book. And the neat thing at this point in time is that I've read so many books on spirituality that I'm able to connect the dots. I'm able to see the pattern recognition between 11 Days in May and all the books that I've read prior. And it's incredible how much it syncs with that. Phenomenal book, very unique book, because it is him talking back and forth with this being. And it's just so profound and so wise, and syncs with so much of the other books I've read. And by the way, at this point in time, I started to really dive into ancient spirituality, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Vedanta, whether it's early Christianity, early Judaism, the Kabbalah, and ultimately ended up finding out that it syncs extremely well with those. And that all these books, frankly, sync extremely well with early spirituality. And I'm talking about the core of spirituality. I'm not talking about religious dogma. Those are different things. There are religious practices, which thank goodness we've moved on from. The Christians used to have crusades. We as Jews used to burn animals at the altar. One of the things the world has to grapple with right now is radical jihadism in Islam. That's a very small number of the Muslim population, but it's an issue, right? It's an issue that needs to be transcended. And so this book, 11 Days in May, I can tell you is profoundly wise. I've become very good friends with JD Messenger, similar to the way I became great friends with Mark Gober. You will see JD Messenger on this podcast too. I'll be recording that in the next couple of months. We just talked about that today. So I'm really excited about that, to dive into his book with you. But given that you're going to get this well before that episode, dive into that book. Get it on Audible too, because like Eben Alexander, who wrote Proof of Heaven and the Map of Heaven, he reads it and you can hear the awe and the wonder and the humility in his voice of having this communion with this being and the beyond. It's phenomenal. Okay, so continuing on in May, the next book I read that my soul had me read, it's really funny. It literally happened right after 11 Days in May, is another classic that I'd never heard of. It's called The Untethered Soul, and it's by Michael Singer. And that book actually teaches you very specifically how to have a regular communion with the heavens, with your soul. And it's phenomenal. I've really embodied that book now. One of the very powerful techniques in that book, let's say that there's something that happened to you in the past. It could be someone that wronged you or whatever it is, and you're still holding on to that. The Untethered Soul gets you to understand how to realize that in your heart, and you'll feel it burning in your heart, and then just let it go and live so much lighter. And I have had so many profound conversations with my soul, with my parents' soul, as a result of the practice that is detailed in The Untethered Soul. Great, great book if you want to have that type of communion. I will tell you, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to be able to do that. And it just makes life so much richer and so much more texture, being able to have these types of really deep and profound messages to help you on your journey in what I'll call Earth School. And we'll get into Earth School a little bit at the end of this. Okay, so now going into June, I was presented this book called Signs by Laura Lynn Jackson. This book, oh my gosh, her voice is so beautiful for this book on Audible. And it's just story after story after story of people getting signs from the beyond. I told you about my experience in the Grand Canyon. The woman that I was talking about that has seen a lot of signs from her father through pennies gave me lots of examples of where that's happened to her. And this book will teach you how to find those things. It'll teach you how to listen to them. By the way, if you're not open to these, it will shut it out. The universe will not be able to speak to you if you just close yourself off. But if you open yourself up, you're able to see it. And each chapter of that book, I kid you not, made me cry. I'm not kidding. Tears of joy. You could pick up any chapter of that book in any order and just listen to it like you would a short podcast, or about 8 to 12 minutes long. Beautiful, beautiful book. If you lost someone recently, I've been recommending this book to people that have lost a parent recently. Beautiful, beautiful book. That and book like Proof of Heaven, great books to recommend to anybody that's lost someone. Phenomenal read. Highly, highly recommend you listen to Signs. And I really recommend that one on Audible as well, because you really want to hear her voice. Her voice is so beautiful, and she is just, what a special soul. Also, Mark Gober had her on his podcast, Where Is My Mind? I didn't remember that at the time that someone recommended that book to me, but Mark reminded me of it, and he actually has some outtakes with her where he does an 1.5 hour long episode with her, and you can find that on his website, markgober.com. But just a phenomenal, phenomenal book. Read the book first, though, before you watch the interview that Mark did with her. Great book. So now this takes me into July, okay, and I'm on a walk with a great friend, Taro. He's the founder of a company called Four Sigmatic. I'm a big health nut. Every day when I wake up, I end up having a smoothie, and I use these different mushroom blends in my smoothie. One for focus, for mental clarity, one protein powder by Four Sigmatic, their chocolate one. All the ingredients are organic. These are things like lion's mane chaga. These are not psychedelics, to be clear. Just, functional mushrooms. And Four Sigma is the genesis of the name Four Sigmatic because it's looking for the most functional foods on the planet. So Taro and I are on this walk around beautiful Lake Austin downtown, and I'm talking to him about my journey and how alive my soul is. And he said, that happened to me too. And I've read over 130 books. And I said, oh, wow. Well, what was your favorite out of all 130? And he tells me it's this book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello. Well, Anthony DeMello, I find out, I knew that I was meant to read that book, is a Jesuit priest. It really doesn't matter like what religion he is. That's not part of the story, but just by way of background, he was born in India. He becomes this Jesuit priest. But he's kind of like the George Carlin of spiritual teachers. My dad was a big fan of George Carlin growing up. George Carlin, like a lot of comedians, is like a philosopher king. He's able to teach you things through comedy. And that's the best comedians are able to do that. So Anthony DeMello is the same as a spiritual teacher. It's a really fun one on Audible because it's a series of lectures he has about waking up. And humanity right now really needs to wake up for us to reach that age of abundance for all. It has to. There is no other choice, right? Humanity has to make this evolutionary leap to become, as Chris Bosch would say, the diamond soul. And this book, oh my gosh, this book is so great. Anybody that's suffering and dealing with any form of regret about the past or anxiety about the future, this book is for you. I just recommended this book to another friend today who's diving into it. I think he's really going to benefit from it. But Awareness by Anthony DeMello. I'm glad I read it as late as I did. My soul presented that much later because it was the right time for me. And it really syncs with all the other books I've read, but it's very unique, the series of lectures he has around waking up, and that is the most important thing a human being can do to really achieve true happiness. By the way, that syncs a lot with Vedanta. I mentioned that I went to India to learn Vedanta while I was retired after Bazaarvoice went public. And I was retired for that period of time and did a lot of things. And ultimately ended up starting data.world, as you know. But Vedanta, the core principle of Vedanta is that our mind left ungoverned is like a child. It goes between worries about the past, anxiety about the future, and ultimately, if we use our higher intellect to gain control over the mind, that's essentially awareness, then that goes away. We can be in the present. We can be with each other. And that ultimately is what awareness is all about. And gosh, I've been so much happier since reading that book. I mean, I was happy before. By the way, I was happy before I ever even did psychedelics back when I was 50 years old. And ultimately, this book will just be part, again, of your journey and making you far more happier and far better at not being triggered no matter what happens. It could be someone being super rude to you, and you can instead just be aware, not let it bother you. Leverage books like The Untethered Soul is take it in, let it go. Just let it go. Now, if it's someone that you're going to be around a lot, of course, you're going to have a conversation with them, but you can approach that conversation in a really soulful, beautiful way if you practice a book like Awareness and The Untethered Soul. So great, great book. Another book that presented itself to me right after that is called The Mindful Body. This was Dr. Ellen Langer, who is known as the mother of mindfulness. She has, I think, 11 books. She's taught at Harvard for her entire career. She's in her 70s. I've become good friends with her. It was another amazing thing that happened as a result of this MIT event that I went to. Great, great book. It talks about mindfulness being something that you always practice, not just going into a meditation, that it's something that you do every day. and that most of us are walking around in a mindless state all the time. And then maybe we'll do the meditation and then we'll get more mindful. I would say that, her book, The Mindful Body, really helps you understand the science. It's not a book about anything else but science. And the studies that they've done at Harvard in her center that have shown that you can awaken yourself to be mindful throughout your entire body. And that's just another great tool for you. Another highly recommended read. She ends the book with her hope for humanity, very much in sync with all the other books I've read. Great book. Okay, so that takes you to the present. What am I currently reading right after all of these? And by the way, I'm just giving you a fraction of the books I've read. I'm just telling you the ones that are the most important to me that I want to share with you. I'm currently reading a book called Journey of Souls. This is a very advanced book. I do not recommend starting out with it. It's by this guy, Michael Newton. And it's kind of like a meta-analysis of Many Lives, Many Masters by Dr. Weiss. Remember, Dr. Weiss, this is one case study of one patient. Well, Journey of Souls are case studies of over 30 patients of Michael Newton's, where he paints what he thinks is a pretty accurate picture of the reincarnation process and the ascendancy of different levels of souls. It's a really profound book. It's probably the best book I've read about the journey of what it actually is like in heaven. It's much more advanced than Evan Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, or The Map of Heaven. Ultimately, it's profound. Now, look, I want to tell you very clearly, I'm not professing that I know the nature of heaven or I know the nature of God. I want to repeat that again, like I did at the beginning. I think that all these books are grasping at it. I think God is so big of a concept and big of a force in the universe. And we're talking about the power that made the universe. Again, a materialist will say like, hey, grant me the miracle of the Big Bang and I'll explain everything else. Materialism is an act of faith. But ultimately, you think about a book like Journey of Souls, and these are real people under hypnosis, and he's looking at the commonality between them. So it's profound. We'll only know like once we pass away in this physical existence and we cross over, as Laura Lynn Jackson would say, and we're then fully back in our soul. That's when we'll know. I'm not professing to know, but I think it's super fascinating. And I'll tell you that all these books have only made my life better because it tells you how beautiful and sacred and divine life is. So that's what I'm currently reading. The book next up is one that I actually learned about in the Grand Canyon. I was just on that trip. I came back a couple of days ago, and people there were urging me to read Zen and the Art of the Motorcycle. So that bridges Eastern and Western spirituality in a really beautiful way. Apparently the author of that book, when he came out with it, he made millions of dollars, and he then didn't write a single book afterwards and went to live a very simple life. But it's supposed to be really profound. I'm really excited about reading that after I finish Journey of Souls. Okay, so that's a lot of books. Where does that leave me with a message for you? First of all, this is what I believe is the nature of our reality. I believe that Earth is a school for our souls. I believe that we are a physical manifestation, a soul that's living in a physical body, that its ultimate purpose is to manifest as much love, connection, to become a better human, to really change the world for the better, getting back to the core philosophy, the core mantra, if you will, of Judaism, Tikkun Olam. And that's incredibly profound, that's what we're meant to do here. And now think about the age that we're in. There's so much dystopian fear about AI, about job loss, and about this acceleration underway. Look, there's never been anything like this in human history. I was writing a post on LinkedIn a couple of days ago, and I said, when you're in an exponential curve, the only way you can kind of grok that and think exponentially is you look at events. It's kind of like Back to the Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli. You look at the events and you say, how fast is this happening compared to prior times? And for me, having programmed since age 7, since 1979, and now being here in 2025, I can tell you that for me personally, 1 week of AI progress and technology development in 2025 right now feels like a year of tech progress to me 10 years ago. What is it going to feel like 10 years from now with artificial superintelligence? That's probably going to feel like an hour of progress is like what we experience today in a week. So this is why it's so important that we manifest this age of abundance for all. I promised you that I would talk about a country like Chad. So here's how this went down. For that conference I went to at MIT, those 50 CEOs that I had the honor of presenting to, thanks to Randy Cohen, I was picked up at 4:30 in the morning here at our home by an Uber driver. And he is from this country called Chad, okay? I had never heard of Chad. I just hadn't. I'm just being honest. Chad, I start to use ChatGPT as I'm talking to him. He's a super friendly guy. We really hit it off. Yeah, it's 4:30 in the morning, but I could just tell I meant to talk with him, and we're just having a blast talking to each other. And I'm like, wow, $660 of GDP per person. I was like, do you have family? He's like, yeah, my wife and our kids are there. And he's like, and I use this Uber job to send them money. And for them, it's like a lot of money. For me in America, yeah, it's not that much money, but it's so much more than I ever had in Chad. And my hope is that I'm going to save up for the next 6 years, and I'm going to get my wife and children to move here. And oh my gosh, when they move here, what a land of abundance America is. What a land of abundance. And it got me thinking about those people in Chad, and I started to think like, wow, they have in their minds like this hope to move to a place like America. It's a place that a lot of people constantly complain about, all the problems with this or that. And so I start thinking about it. I'm like, that's the answer. The answer is AI. The answer is quantum computing. The answer is robotics. Like imagine an NGO of the future taking $10 million, which is not a lot of money when I'm about to tell you what they could do with it, 10 years from now, and they go into a place like Chad, okay, and they build through robots the clean water supplies they need, the clean energy that they need, the electrical circuitry, to each home that they need, all the pipelining that they need, the energy. And they transform Chad from this place that people want to leave if they can. I looked up how much it would cost to get his family here. Each ticket, the cheapest price round trip, would be $2,400 per person. Okay, this is a country where the GDP is $660 per person. So just think about that. We're talking about 4 years per person of saving up if you live in Chad, where you put all your money, which isn't practical, right? That they have to live and eat. But yet he was here. He really struck me as a very amazing citizen, the type of people that we want to have in America. And here he is telling me this beautiful story of wanting his family here. And I'm thinking to myself, that NGO could create a world of abundance in Chad. This is what I mean by an age of abundance for all. I mean, even in the most impoverished countries in the world, okay, which the bottom 10 are all in the continent of Africa, that they also could have abundance. And think about what a beautiful world that would be. Think about like if we transcend fear and allow love to conquer it, and that we truly look at each other as the divine, beautiful people that we are at our core. That we're all here for this divine purpose, that we reincarnated in this lifetime to make it to that age of abundance for all, that's why we're here right now. And for me, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm putting it all on the field for us to make it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not looking at myself as some savior for humanity, okay? I'm looking at myself as part of the light to overcome the dark. There's many people bringing the light. Eric Schmidt is bringing the light. He was phenomenal recently on the Moonshots podcast that Peter Diamandis does, talking about artificial superintelligence. Phenomenal. He really cares. He wrote the dying work alongside Henry Kissinger called Genesis. The last chapter of that book is beautiful. It's a beautiful prayer for humanity to make it to this age of abundance. It's what Henry Kissinger wanted us to see before he passed away. There's people like Demis Hassabis, who's the co-founder of DeepMind and now in charge of everything AI at Google. He really wants us to make it. He's not as optimistic as me, by the way, from what I can tell, that there's a 95% chance that we do. But he's doing everything he can to really lay it on the field. His co-founder, Mustafa Suleyman, is the head of everything AI at Microsoft. I can tell you he deeply cares. His TED Talk last year was so moving as he talked about how he's explaining AI to his nephew as this new form of a digital species and the importance of working with it so that humanity ends up ultimately manifesting this future. There's people like Dr. Fifi Lee, who's at Stanford, who is a beautiful soul, wrote a beautiful book. She's a product of our immigration system, and she's come here and she's laying it all in the field. There's people like Mira Murati, the former CTO of OpenAI, who's raised $2 billion already at a $10 billion valuation for a startup. I don't even know what they're going to do, but I can almost assure you it's going to be around some form of AI safety. That's why the co-founders of OpenAI left to go form Anthropic, which is the second fastest growing AI company after OpenAI. And they have a model called Claude that I use all the time. I use Claude, I use ChatGPT, I use Google Gemini, I use them all. I'm very much in these technologies. You're looking at a guy who's been programming since he was 7. I know how to use these technologies. I know how powerful they are, and I'm able to project where they go because I experienced the crappiness of printers when they first came out and modems when they first came out. And, things like the internet with AOL, et cetera. And I've seen what's happened. And we're in this time where humanity is accelerating so quickly. So I think the nature of our reality, this reality, Earth, is that it's a school for all of us. And I really believe deep down, and I saw this in one of my journeys, that God deeply wants us to make it. God wants us to reach the age of abundance for all. God does not want us to extinguish ourselves, but it's up to all of us. Everybody watching this, it's up to you. What can you do? If you thought the world was going to end potentially in 10 to 15 years, what would you do now? I ask myself as a Jew sometimes, what would I have done in the 1940s when the Nazis were starting to implement the Holocaust? Would I have just sat there like a sheep? Or would I have done something? I want to feel like I would have done something, and I'm certainly putting it all in the field for you. Again, welcome to Love Conquers Fear. Thank you so much for weathering this pretty long episode. There was a lot that I needed to get out there. You'll see future episodes be a little bit shorter than this one, but I'll be diving in deeply with phenomenal guests. I'm so blessed, from TED and the Henry Crown Fellowship and Dialogue and other amazing things I've been invited to all over the world. And I've gone for so many times, and I've got this amazing network to tap. And so you're going to see some of the best technologists, some of the best investors, some of the best, consciousness researchers, some of the best spiritual teachers. You're going to see some of the most amazing AI experts and CEOs on this podcast. And so I'm excited for the journey with you. My hope here is that this podcast and my book that I'm writing, which again is called Love Conquers Fear, Humanity, AI, and the Age of Abundance for All, are part of the light that we all need to make it to this age together and have that unity and that prophecy come true, that heaven and earth actually do merge. It's this lifetime, and it's up to all of us. Team humanity all the way. Thanks again. This is Brett Hurt.